Hello there, welcome back to the channel. This is Nerdworld, and today I am looking at a ship that defies some of the lore effectively established within Star Trek and proves that not everything abides by the rules, and that is the Swarm Fighter. Now, ordinarily within Star Trek, fighter craft are pretty damn useless, but here we prove that fighters can be effective craft. Now, there have been a few fighter type ships in Star Trek that have proven one form or another to be fairly effective, and I thought I'd cover a few of them in a few little videos, and this one we're starting with the Swarm Fighter. Before we get started, please like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and tell me of any other suggestions for effective fighter craft within Star Trek. And with that said, let's get started. Now, to viewers of previous Star Trek videos from my channel, to address the small caveat here. Yes, I've done videos many times where I ramble on about how fighter craft in Star Trek are useless, and that is true most of the time. This is because races like the Federation, the Romulans, tend to rely on large, heavily armed cruisers with pinpoint accurate weapons that generally will cut through the hull and shields of a small craft simply because it doesn't have the power plant to really adequately defend itself against such power. Or it's simply not maneuverable enough or fast enough or whatever other technology to prevent the weapons from hitting it in the first place. But that's where these ships differ. The Swarm Fighter is a small craft, a fighter craft. It is a little large for a traditional fighter, but it's still a relatively small ship. It's probably about the same size as the Delta Flyer. I'll get to the specifics of it in a little bit, but just to give it a bit of an overview. The fighter is weirdly lacking in weaponry. Now, in the episode, the Swarm Fighter, literally the race gets their name because no one really knows much about them, because they swarm around the ship and then they attach themselves to the hull, they drain the power, they drain the shields, and then they board the ship and kill the crew. This is as much a terror tactic to deal with their enemies as it is an effective way of doing it. It also means they can capture the ship and its technology and whatever else about the species they want because they've simply caught the vessel as well. The ship's exact full potential capabilities are a little unknown, but they are very fast. They're warp capable. They've clearly got long-term survivability capabilities for the specific species that crew them. And their main offense and defense, interestingly, is an interferometric pulse generator, which all the ships are connected by via a sort of lattice energy structure between the vessels. This allows the ships to disperse any energy that is directed at them. It also prevents effective weapons lock on the craft, meaning that it's harder to hit them in the first place. But the weakness, as exploited by the crew of the Voyager, was that because of this interconnectivity, if you hit them right and you hit them hard enough, it disperses the energy amongst several of the fighter craft. Not all of them, but enough of them to give them a bloody nose. And seemingly the craft are not armed with alternative weapons, or if they are, they chose not to use them against Voyager due to the immediate losses that they were probably not accustomed to taking, as many races in the Delta Quadrant simply lacked the capability to fight them. That said, this species were fairly unique in the Delta Quadrant, partly probably because of their method of defense and their culture being seriously territorial and xenophobic and having a language that was so complicated no one could understand it, which you'd think they themselves would know, being so territorial that no one can bloody understand them. But anyway, maybe they just didn't care, or they're a bit like the Breen and they kind of like the anonymity of it. But this race, as I said, they would swarm around you, drain your power, take everything, but their technology is distinctive. For such small craft, they're very fast. They can easily keep pace with the Federation starship Voyager, one of the fastest ships in the fleet, built by a species that prides itself on being fast and puts speed as a high priority within its naval assets. The Swarm Fighters are easily able to keep up with and overtake the vessel, dragging it out of warp, surrounding it and overpowering it. It is also noted they don't need to, although they could potentially do this because it kind of makes sense that in case this system ever went down, they'd have a redundancy, they could cut through the hull. They don't need to. This race utilized transporter technology, and transporter technology that was sufficiently advanced enough they could fit it inside of a shuttle, sort of large shuttlecraft-sized vessel, so they could board the ship. This was rare in the Delta Quadrant, very few species having this capability. And yeah, they were a fairly unique culture for that level of technology and sort of strangeness in the Delta Quadrant. I should also point out that it always, to a degree, it emphasizes some of the hypocrisy I see in Voyager. And I love Voyager, I do. I love the characters, I love the show. But there was sometimes a little bit of hypocrisy. We'll stick to the Federation's rules. One of the Federation's rules, the Prime Directive, all that jazz, was we don't violate other races' territory. Now, for the inconvenience of having to go around swarm space, which was admittedly big, they decided to go through, risking the ship. Now, the Equinox made this mistake with the Kryptonian Guard. The difference was Voyager was a little more successful, but instead of going around, they went through, because going around would take longer. But for the sake of adding a bit of time onto a journey that, let's face it, was going to be longer than their lifespans anyway, they might as well have gone around and respected this race's borders. They may have even found another way of doing it, but anyway, that was a beside the point issue. Okay, right, without going into, like, properly measuring the length on the hull and everything, if you actually watch this scene of where the swarm fighters are landing on the hull of Voyager, particularly the ones that are landing near the shuttle bay, you can see roughly how much space they're taking up. They're not an overly wide craft, they're reasonably long, and they're very flat. But if you really look at if you look at an image of when the Delta Flyer comes out of the rear shuttle bay of the Intrepid class, these fighters are probably taking up just a little bit more space than what the Delta Flyer would do. So if you analyze how big the Delta Flyer is versus these fighters, you realize they're roughly the same sort of size range, which, for reference sake, is about 15 meters in length. I'd say the ship's a little smaller than the Delta Flyer, so we might be looking at about 12 meters, 13 meters maybe, but that is something of a guess. We don't know a lot of the ship's other capabilities. As I said earlier, we don't know if they're armed with anything additional to the interferometric pulse generators, if they have phasers, disruptors, plasma weapons, or some other form of weapon, or even torpedoes. They do have shields and other defenses, but they do seem to be relatively limited, relying primarily on interferometric pulses and not knowing how to deal with an enemy that's bypassed that seemingly singular offensive/defensive capability that the craft have. That said, that is pretty much all we know about the fighter. Now, I'm going to do another couple of videos on other fighter classes I'm picking out from Star Trek that are actually relatively effective, but will demonstrate why they're effective compared to, say, the Peregrine class, which is not an overly effective craft. It's useful under very select circumstances. It is a useful ship, not necessarily effective. You can imagine you'd feel a lot more comfortable going up against a Cardassian Gala-class destroyer on the bridge of the USS Defiant or similar Defiant-class warship than you would on the helm control of a Peregrine-class fighter, without a large number of them to make the attack more worthwhile. Now, although the Maquis managed to hit and run tactics, unless they had no choice, they wouldn't directly engage a Cardassian ship like that unless they were given no other choice. These fighters overcame those inherent weaknesses, and I found that most of the other fighter-type craft used in Star Trek overcome these deficiencies in one form or another, usually revolving around overwhelming numbers. But with that said, if you made it all the way to the end of the video, thank you for watching, and bye-bye.